Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and this is Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined in this episode by C.L. Clarke, author of The Unbroken, a brutal and complex military fantasy series that follows a colonial soldier returned to the homeland she was stolen from, and a princess in search of a turncoat to help throw her uncle off the throne. The first book in the Magic of the Lost series, The Unbroken, arrives March 23rd from Orbit Books. And Sheree, welcome to Fictitious.
Hey, Adrian, thanks for having me.
Okay, so this book's been really buzzy. There's a lot of people in the fantasy realm talking about it. Just looking around and seeing like all the people talking about it on Goodreads, seeing there's been some really interesting discussion of it over on Reddit too, which is a place that I lurk but don't really spend a lot of time at. But just I think it's really capturing people's attention. One, because it's a very complex story about characters that have some very conflicted situations going on, both emotionally, how they are compromised by their positions in society, by their positions in this like colonial military system, and there's some interesting power dynamics and stuff at play as well. I'd be curious, as we get going here, how do you describe this novel? What's your kind of elevator pitch for it? And then we'll dive into it and really start getting into the weeds on this.
Yeah, so your quick pitch at the beginning is spot on about the plot. It's about a conscripted colonial soldier who's loyal to the empire, and then the empire's princess who's trying to get her uncle off of her throne. But at the core of it, for me, it's about how people live in systems that are oppressive to some and not to others, and how it feels being caught in between.
There are a lot of thematic elements that I want to dive into here. Clearly, the colonial part of this, I feel like there isn't a part of the story that element doesn't touch, because it has such a huge impact on the characters' backgrounds, how they interact with each other. In a lot of ways, I feel like it's the core antagonist of the book, because everything in the story is affected by that. As you were setting out to write this first novel, and like I said, it is part of the first book in a series, did you have some of these things in mind where you're like you had some stuff that you really wanted to talk about and you had found a fantasy framework to explore it? Did you have that story first, these characters, and then found your way into these ideas? Like, how did that develop for you?
I don't know if I think of it in terms of themes. For me, that's always, I don't know, very English school or English class about it. That's what the reader looks for to me. But I did have some questions when I was going into it, like what ifs. What if women were allowed to be violent the same way men were allowed to be violent in fantasy books? What if we tell this very common fantasy story about a heroic conqueror empire, the heroic king, but we tell it from the point of view of the people that the king conquered, that kind of thing instead. If we're going to go explore for these cool magic artifacts, let's look at who we're taking it from instead.
I think it's worth noting, like you said there, I mean, this is kind of, you have a lot of the perspective of the people who were conquered rather than the conqueror. It's something I think that a lot of us that have grown up with fantasy have had to like unpack a lot of over the last like decade or so. Especially like somebody like me, like, I mean, I grew up, late 80s, early 90s, just, getting whatever fantasy would hand it to me. And I was like a straight white kid in rural Midwest. I wasn't really aware of the status quo of what I was reading, and how much a lot of other people weren't being represented, and how much I was just being like, okay, yeah, cool. Like, the something bad happens, the hero comes in, does the thing, the status quo is restored, everything's great. And then, you read out those things with a more nuanced understanding later on, and you're like, oh, there's some really crap lessons in a lot of these stories, and a lot of things that seem really underexplored. This book, it should be noted that it's very female focused as far as the characters. Most of the primary characters being followed are women. They are in positions of power. They are in the military. They are in the government. They are not to be messed with in a lot of ways. And the centered relationship at the core of the story, what I would think of as the story engine of this whole thing, is between two women that have a very distinct power imbalance between them. Which is something I want to dig into a little bit more as we go into on here. But I do like the fact that you mentioned, whenever I ask questions about theme or trope or any of that stuff on this story, I'm very aware that for a lot of people, that is like the English major questions, and I was an English major. But it was the kind of thing that I would sit in classes and the instructor would be going on and on about like, oh, this was the intention of the author and stuff. And sometimes I was like, maybe they figured it out after the fact, which I think is perfectly fine, because sometimes, the first draft of any book is you telling the story to yourself and sometimes discovering what you want to say, which I think is also entirely valid. Looking at the setting of this, it is a fantasy world, but it's all the description of this mentioned that it's based on North Africa. I don't, forgive me because I don't know my world history super well, but I've seen a lot of people make the comparison that it seems a lot like France's occupation of Algeria. I don't know how valid that is or not, but I'm curious from your standpoint, what was this influenced by? What research was involved with it? Does it mirror some of the real world in a lot of ways, and how does it diverge from those things?
So I would definitely not say this is based on France and Algeria or France and Morocco or Tunisia, surely because this is a fantasized, fictionalized world, and the complications of that actual history is not mine, and it's also much more complicated than I could render in like a few fantasy books. Like that's the subject of people's dissertations. But what I will say is that I was inspired by that relationship, but also the relationship, not just between France and North Africa, but colonial relationships in general. So that includes some of my research, which went into the Bear regime and South African apartheid, British India, US and Australian treatment of Indigenous people, and US and Black people, Spain and Portugal in South America, and even just how all of these different imperial nations treated their soldiers, that they would take from these colonized places and use as conscripts. So like Black American soldiers used during the World Wars, and French use of North African soldiers, British taking Indian soldiers to fight in the Arab world during World War One, and how, like the treatment discrepancies in between them. It just so happens that my specific academic background is Franco-colonialism. And so that set up a lot of where I started.
I think it's very telling that there are a lot of different historical sources that could be mined for something like this, seeing just how much of our shared human history is full of people going someplace else, conquering them, taking, their livelihoods from them and turning them into their own personal soldiers against their wills.
That's obviously where our fantasy stories came from, right? Our tradition of fantasy exists as it does because it was written by the European Western writers who were benefiting from these, like, even if we go back to Tolkien, who were benefiting from the negative aspects of, they were the colonizers, right? And so this fantasy of going into this place and fighting these people who are clearly bad and usually brown, and showing them the right and true way to live under the one true king, that's because that's what they did. And so much of it is this fantasy of getting to live it out, maybe themselves with a bit more power or something like that.
It's probably worth noting. So like this is, I mean, it's a pretty big book. There's some heft to this. Unlike some stories in fantasy where there seems to be a sprawl, where like you've got dozens of characters running all over the world, and you think of like a Game of Thrones or something where you have a map where like, oh, we're all over the place. The Unbroken is fairly centered. There is a primary location where a lot of this stuff is taking place. The focus is not so much on running around the world and seeing all these other places in it, but focused on the characters and conflict, and particularly the decision making of the characters that are at the core of this story. Before we dive into those characters, what can you tell me about the location, about the culture, the politics? Like, what is the primary setting of this novel?
So the novel is set in Khazal, which is a colony of the imperial power, which is called Ballader. I chose for it to be centered, partly because I really just wanted to focus on the relationships of the people who lived in the city, as well as the soldiers, because I wanted those different relationships to clash, and I wanted the relationships of the Balladeran soldiers who were not Sans. I wanted those relationships to clash, and having it all in one space kept that conflict contained. And also, I think it's just such an intricate, complicated conflict. Spreading it out would dilute it in a way that I don't think would have served the story well, especially when we're learning all of these new things, these new characters, these new like national histories. It's easier to keep it focused, keep it tight in one space. And then in like maybe book 2 or book 3, after you've already got a good grounding in who are the major players, then you can build out on the relationship, or then I can build out on the rest of the world. And so at the moment, that's the plan.
Now, you mentioned the Sands in there.
Mm-hmm.
So one of our primary characters, Terrain, is a member of this group that's referred to as the Sands. She's one of these conscripted soldiers. She was stolen away as a child from her homeland, and pretty much from the age of 4 or 5, raised to be a member of these soldiers. Her identity previous to that is more or less erased, at least as she remembers it or chooses to remember it. But at the beginning of this story, I mean, it kicks right off with basically a group of the Sands making landfall in the city of Kazal, several of them having that awareness that this is where they were from before they were turned into soldiers. What can you tell me more about? I want to elaborate on the Sands, because I think that looking at this group of conscripted people from a lot of different places whose identity has been rewritten in service of an empire is one of the more interesting elements of identity in this story. So what can you tell me about their role in things, how they're conscripted into the empire, how they're viewed by the other people? Because certainly, they're not equals in a lot of ways. So what does that look like in the story?
The way I wrote the Sands, for me, it was very much a reflection of many people who are in some sort of marginalized position in society. You've got some amount of privilege, for example, above other people who might look like you, and so you are a little higher in the hierarchy, but not high enough maybe to be viewed as fully human or to have full benefits of moving through society, but maybe you're comfortable, or you can overlook some of these negative aspects if you just focus on whatever your job is or whatever your current position is in life. Like there's some way that you can be the model version of a minority. So the model minority, or the idea that if you just do as you're told, you'll live well. If you imitate the power party, you'll be fine, or you'll be able to access that realm of power. And so with the Sands, as you read, you'll find that there are different characters who ascribe to different aspects of that, or different strategies to how to get along as an oppressed person. And some of them don't see themselves as oppressed, or they even have disdain for the people in Kazal. They see themselves as better. And I think it reflects a lot of the complicated relationships that people have with other people, even just as far as generations. And like it could be a class thing, like maybe your grandparents didn't have money, and all of a sudden like you've grown up in a certain amount of like privilege and wealth, and so some of the things that they do, you might look down on them because you're like, oh, why do you do this? But those things are from a different time, or a different circumstance, cutting from where you came from.
Thinking about Terrain as this character coming back to Kazal, and there's some interesting dialogue right at the beginning of the story where she's with a couple of the other members of the Sands, and one of them has like more real memory of the place, or at the very least a kind of memory, because I think something that's always important to remember is that our memories reshape as we get older. We imagine things long enough that we can change the reality of that in our own minds. And so we might remember something from when we were kids as being much grander than it was because we were seeing it from a perspective that was very different that we might as an adult. Yes, quite. In fact, it's even said at one point where like her memories are of things from very low perspective, looking up at the world and seeing it in a different scale. And that has a big impact. And the longer we're away from something, I think the more we can either romanticize it or diminish it as much as we can even hold on to those details. For terrain, showing back up in the city has a lot of impacts. There's a bit of action that starts right up at the beginning where there's essentially an assassination attempt. And terrain is key in foiling that thing from happening from these like basically some rebels that are in the city there. But in so doing, she comes face to face with somebody who recognizes her features and they recognize her as being the daughter of somebody, right? They know her by the name that she has not been called since she was 5 years old and had been conscripted. So I kind of want to look into, for a character like that showing up in this situation, you were talking about there how if you are part of this social system where you've been elevated above some people, but you're not quite at the same league as other ones, terrain is like, it shows a lot of motivation to rise. She's looking to impress the people above her in the military hierarchy. She's looking to catch the eye of political people. There is a drive to excel and improve her place and to prove herself. What pushes those drives? What about her situation really motivates all of that? And then how does the situation in this new city or her old city test those loyalties and push her to make some changes as far as how she views the world?
I hesitate to answer that a little bit because then I might just have to say the whole book.
I mean, the least spoilers version that we can, as far as just kind of set up so people will understand what's going on.
Well, I mean, have you ever had a teacher that made you feel really good, but not good enough? And you wanted to be like them. So clearly, if you just kept doing what they told you, you'd be able to achieve just like they did. And they would be proud of you. And one day when you grow up, you could be just like them, a really cool teacher. So take that feeling and then add in all of that good colonial stuff that we put in where, you're told that the person you used to be isn't good enough, but you could possibly achieve this holy grail of ideals for your favorite teacher, and then shake it up and stir, and then you have terrain. as far as what happens when we get there to Kazal, it's very much like, well, we did tell you that all of this stuff was bad, but then she starts all of this stuff being her past, she starts getting more acquainted with it, not necessarily because she wants to, but because circumstances make her face it.
One thing I tend to gravitate towards in stories is I like when seeds of doubt are introduced to people who are otherwise very certain about themselves. Because whether in this case, part of it is self-knowledge, it's her discovering things about her background, about her own history that she was not aware of and maybe didn't really let herself think too much about in the past. Or if it's just learning about the reality of the world, how people are treated, how people are oppressed, how people are elevated, the kinds of things that make you stop and go, oh, I have devoted my life to this thing and it's a sham. Now, what do I do about that? To me, those are the kinds of things that really, muddy up the ethical waters. And for me, that's where a lot of really interesting character stuff happens. Part of Terrain's journey in this is coming into contact with Princess Luca, who is very powerful in her own way, but she is just off the throne because she has an uncle who is the regent. And that is a situation that Luca isn't pleased with and would not like to see continue. And for her own personal reasons, she is looking for a way to supplant that and take over that position on the throne. But she needs a tool to do that. She needs something something or someone. There was a blurb somewhere that talked about like walking the bayonet edge between treason and orders. And I really liked that bit of phrasing. I forget who had said that, but I thought that was really evocative of the situation here, of what she finds in Terrain. But
I
Terrain
wrote
is...
that actually.
Oh, okay. Well, that was great. That's very... Most authors don't write the little succinct, pithy bits. So that was really, really strong. I like that one a lot. Looking at that kind of situation between the two of them, and but then Luca and Terrain also, their relationship develops in kind of a turbulent other way. There's romance. There are some turnabouts in there as far as how they treat each other. In particular, I think it's very worth noting that there is a huge power imbalance between these two.
Mm-hmm.
One is a princess of the colonial empire. The other one is a conscripted, rising in the ranks, becoming her very powerful and of her own agency in her own right, but still not in that same league and still being manipulated in a lot of ways. What more can you tell us about that dynamic, about the way those two characters work together, about Luca? And there's more about her that I want to circle back to, but I think it's really a important thing to kind of explore who those characters are and how you approached writing that relationship.
It's a very complicated relationship, and I definitely, I do not intend for it not to be problematic. That's definitely something I want people thinking about it. If they think it is a happy romance, and I guess for fair warning, if you guys see this before reading, it's not that. It sprang from, yes, I do enjoy a very particular trope. I like enemies to lovers a lot because I'm really interested in like the intimacy of hate. But I also wanted to see what it would look like to be proper enemies, not like rivals to like rival enemies to lovers, but like genuinely, I have the power to destroy everything you love enemies, like that kind of enemies to lovers. And so usually when I describe the Unbroken as this trope, I don't call it enemies to lovers. It's like enemies to enemy. Because definitely at the end of the Unbroken, we don't have, well, I'm going to stop that sentence right there. Let's just say it's more complicated than can be resolved in one book, especially in any like positive way. And one of the things I wanted to explore is what kind of negotiation would that kind of power balance, that kind of enmity take to become something that is mutually respectful? Is it possible? Is like a long-lasting romance something that could come out of something that, or is it just like sexual attraction, then boom, and then like you go off and try to kill each other again? I don't like it. Who knows? But part of it also has so much to do with Terrain's growth and agency. It would be hard for me to say that she feels just completely in love with Luca because she recognizes the power imbalance just as much, well, actually, probably a lot more than Luca. Luca's a bit, um, you know. But Terrain is much more aware that she doesn't have that much power in the relationship and that she might, in fact, have to use that, like use Luca's feelings to get what she wants. There's a point where this even becomes an argument that they have. And so much of it has to do, in a perspective sense, is how independent can Terrain be? If she can't come into her own, then no relationship will ever be even. And similarly, Luca will have to decide what, like, how much her power is worth, or is there anything that she can do to, I don't know, she would have a lot to have to redeem herself for, if they were going to be in any positive, like mutually beneficial relationship. Uh,
It almost makes me think of, I mean, we've seen a lot of these conversations happen in corporate America over, the last decade or so, of like how often it's like, when a boss gets into a relationship with an employee, like, is that a fair balance? Is that something where even as consenting adults, is it ethical? Is it reasonable? And of course, and that usually doesn't involve, bloodshed and overthrowing of leadership and empires and things like that. It's a lot more complicated once you throw in all those other factors as well.
mhm.
But it's certainly a thing that should be explored. And I think that it's worth noting things like that, because sometimes people come in, they're like, oh, there's a romance involved, and particularly if it's this is a lesbian romance in a fantasy story, which up until recently has been fairly underrepresented. So I think
Mhm.
sometimes when people are going in, they're like, I'm so excited for this, and they're like, oh no, it's toxic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be, because there's a lot, it's fraught, with lots and lots of other issues in there. And so, yeah, it's good to look at that. Something also I think it's worth mentioning is Luca, the princess, actually has some physical disability. And I liked the way you're portraying that in this story, because she has a history that has caused her some physical ailment. It does affect how she does things, but doesn't keep her from doing things. And it's refreshing to see a character who has chronic pain and has a little bit of difference in mobility be a front and center main character without it being something that's like you're hit over the head with. And I say that as a person who has a couple of sources of chronic pain. Growing up with fantasy stories, you get this idea of people run into a battle, they get the crap beat out of them, they take a healing potion, they walk away, and everything's fine. You feel great afterwards. In reality, those little damages chip away at us. And for people who are dealing with those issues, like, it's a daily thing that they have to work around, and find their own solutions, and hope that the world treats them on a level playing field even if they are dealing with something that's an additional challenge. For you, what was your approach in writing that? Like, how does that figure into the character of Luca? How does that figure into your process as far as writing something like that sensitively, but also making it work in the story and make it function for your character?
When I started writing Luca, I knew that she definitely has negative experiences with other characters, particularly in Ballader. Because of it, it has influenced how she's seen in court sometimes. And in a chapter, I talk about how she navigated the fad of everybody learning to use swords, and how she eventually negotiates that for herself. But it had more to do with her own interpretation of herself, and some of the things I've taken from like my own physical experience. I'm an athlete and have played some very physical sports. I used to play rugby, and that is not something that you walk away from unscathed usually.
Yeah.
um, Definitely very familiar with chronic pain, especially like leg hip issues. And so that honestly is just where things started, but also just taking a very humane expanse. Like, I've listened to disabled readers talking about things they hated in fantasy, things that I wouldn't want to see.
Yeah, I think anytime that you're approaching things like that, the challenge with anything is that everybody's experience is different, and
Mhm.
and we're also in a time period where hitting any kind of hot button issue, some people are like, oh my gosh, that speaks to me perfectly, and other ones are like, that's not my experience at all. How dare you? And
Mhm.
so I'm always interested in how people approach those things from the standpoint of their own experience versus what their beta readers might say, what their editorial might say, to which the feedback might be, and everybody brings their own experience, their own life, their own perspective into the reading, and so we'll find different things in it. But again, I liked seeing that in there.
I mean, I gravitate in all questions like to kindness first, generosity first, and that's, I think, honestly would be pretty good advice for writers in general, regardless of whose perspective you're writing from. It's a good place to start from.
I agree, and pretty much a good mantra for life in general, like alongside writing, but in everything else too. We focused on just two of the main characters. There are quite a number of other ones that occupy this world and their space. And also, I mean, I think probably worth noting that like the decisions and the actions of these two women have some pretty big ramifications for themselves, for the people around them, for everything. And some of those decisions are not necessarily very well conceived. When people are pressed and they have a lot of writing on it, they don't always necessarily make rational decisions or well-informed ones or ones that they stop to think their way through. And Terrain in particular, I think, is somebody who acts in the moment, not necessarily taking the time to fully consider all the ramifications of those choices. With that in mind, who are just, without kind of really digging too deep, who are some of these other characters that operate in this world alongside them? And how do they get swept up in the actions of these women?
They're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're in the wrong place at the right time. I guess it just depends. I mean, because we have the Rebel Council. I mean, they're working against the Empire, and so when they need to talk, when the Empire needs to send, or when Luca rather wants to send envoys, she figures out who she needs to talk to. I mean, I do keep it fairly close. Like most of the characters are people who are political actors for the most part. I have a fairly tight cast in that way, just because it's hard enough to keep track of all these guys, man. So there's that. But as far as like the decision making, I mean, I really just wanted to reflect that even when we do think that we're thinking things through really well, other people are also thinking through things, and we can't always predict what they're going to do. We may expect something and get something completely different, or even worse, they will tell us that they will do one thing and do something else. And if you trust that person, then you don't have any reason to assume that they wouldn't, unless you're more skeptic, or if you've been rolled once before. But some of that stuff you don't know until it happens. Terrain has made some choices in her life. She regrets like 99% of them, if that makes everybody feel better.
I like, though, that you mentioned that that the cast list is pretty tight. It makes me think, like, a couple of days ago, I got a publicist email for a new novel coming out, and it mentioned like sort of Tolkien inspired fantasy with like a huge sprawling cast, and I felt like my eyes crossed just thinking about it. And I don't know why. I grew up reading things like Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time and stuff like that, where you do have these enormous casts, and to a lesser extent, some of the. I didn't get into Game of Thrones. I've never read the books. I've only seen the TV series and stuff like that. And I see the appeal of large casts, but at the same time, these days I feel like maybe it's just because of my own fractured attention span. I like to be able to spend a lot of time with a smaller group and really get into them. And so when I see things that are pitched this way, I just worry. I'm like, are we going to get like a bunch of really cool archetypes running around and cardboard characters? I mean, and clearly in the hands of a great writer, you can still get very three-dimensional characters like that. But for me, there's something very appealing about a story that really spends time with a handful of characters and explores those dynamics. So I dig that part a lot. I want to take a dive into the nuts and bolts part of craft here, and just kind of talk about your writing process. This is your debut novel, correct? And again, fairly substantial first work. I'm going to guess that's probably 100,000 words or so, maybe somewhere around there. Or
like 150.
150. Oh my gosh. Well, I think that I've got the advanced reader's copy, and so sometimes I think those are a little condensed. They make the fine print small for us with the spectacles, having a little trouble with it. But yeah, a lot of words, a lot of stuff in there. I want to know, for you getting into the series then, did you come into this as an outliner or a discovery writer, pantser, some mix of the two? What's that look like for you?
So the first draft of The Unbroken was it was mostly pantsed. I had some like basic idea of like fake framework, like if this is a rebellion story, we're going to have like this happened, and this happened, and then overthrow. Boom. So very, very, very loose outline. And revision was so horrific after that,
Oh, no.
that I never wanted to do it again. So now I outline, and I enjoy it. It doesn't take away any of the magic for me, because I spend my outline doing all sorts of stupid brainstormy things like, well, what if we do this? And what if we go here? And all that kind of stuff. Then I have at least like a list of scenes to hit. So when I inevitably write through and hit a scene where I'm like, well, now I have no idea what to do. This scene that I outlined sucks. I don't want to do that anymore. And I have another chance to come up with something new. Like it still gives me the flexibility to go off script or whatever. But I usually have a better idea after I've outlined of who the characters are. And because I know who they are better, I can write through those sticking points a bit better. Like they can make decisions in a more interesting way, more consistently, maybe. I don't know. Or consistently inconsistent, depending on who they are. And so, yeah, the outline has been really like a relief. I'm going through, like, I'm working on book 2 right now. And so I'm going through, I outlined it first and wrote a draft. It was actually relatively easy. Like, I'm not going to say it was easy, but it was comparatively easy to get through. And I'm thinking about revisions for it at the moment. And it's, though there will be a lot of work to do, it's much less drastic, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Don't hold me to that. Like I make no promises. But right now, it feels like it might not be the worst thing ever.
It's one of the things I think is actually really cool about outlining is being able to do a lot of the problem solving in a more skeletal fashion, so that when it comes time to actually really write the prose, there's less chance of having to do massive revisions or to kill your darlings or throw huge amounts of the story away, because you've already, I mean, to take a line from like TV writers, you've already broken the story. You've already started to figure out where things need to go. When Nikki Drayton was just on the show, she talked about how like she outlines a third at a time, so that she does the first third and that allows her to have figured out that first part as she's writing. And then she gets the next part, then she figures out the next third and then the next third, which gives her a little bit more room for pivoting, or there's still a discovery aspect. Like she hasn't figured out the entirety of it, but she still kind of knows where it's going. And I thought that was a pretty interesting approach as well. But I think for me, the idea of writing 150,000 words and then having to go back and being like, okay, how do I make this make sense?
That
now?
wasn't even right. Now I have to do this and this and this.
Yeah. So yeah, and I like that you mentioned too, like for some people, and a lot of people, the authors that have shown up on the show who are discovery writers, they said that it is that magic. They need that discovery element to stay interested. They feel like if they write the outline and everything is done, then suddenly like they're like, oh, I'm not interested in the story anymore. I already told it. And I get like, certain brains work that way. For me, in my own work and the stuff that I'm doing now, it's like the discovery of being able to write an outline and then layer things on top of it has helped my brain an awful lot. So I like what you were talking about there. And I grimace at that idea of that first draft and how much work that must have been to wrangle that all together.
I remember reading somewhere, I don't know off the top of my head, but some writer, craft person said that everybody outlines. It's just a matter of whether you do it in a draft form or if you're doing it like in bullet points or note cards or whatever. And pointed out that maybe just one takes longer than the other and results in different revision techniques, essentially. So unless you're just like really, really good and your first draft is just like, it's not me and I'm jealous of whoever it is.
Along with like outlining and stuff, have you played with any kind of plotting systems? Have you used anything, whether it's a traditional 3 or 4 act structure or a Save the Cat or 7 Point, or there's dozens, any number books? Is there anything like that you've used?
Well, I'm a bit of a craft book nerd, sometimes to the detriment of like my actual writing. But so I've used, or at least read, I've read Save the Cat, I've read A Story by Robert McKee, I've read, really, it feels like everything. But I do find myself gravitating to the 4 act structure as I read it in Story Engineering, I think it's called, by Larry Brooks. And, there's stuff that I don't like about the book. But I did find a good practical system that resonated with the way I interpret stories and the way I wanted to tell them. And so that part has sort of stuck with me. And at this point, I think maybe it's sort of hybridizing in my brain with some of the other stuff I've read. But it's a 4 act structure. You can see actually, if you look at the Unbroken, it's fairly evenly divided into quarters with titles. I think if you read that craft book and then read the Unbroken, or vice versa, you would see some of the commonalities in it. But I don't know, there's just something about it that resonates for me. I think it incorporates some things, like the three act structure is technically present. It's just with the two middle parts in one lump instead. The 7 point structure, those positions sort of exist in the four act structure. I don't know if they're called the same thing or not. But yeah, the turning points work for me. Like, I think the actual quarters are kind of divided into different phases of a hero's active level or action level. I don't know, like how proactive they are, I think is more accurate. But at the same time, I'm very aware, and I've been thinking about it more lately, that a lot of this is a very westernized method of storytelling. And it's not even the only one, it's just the most current, most popular, commodified version right now. So, this other craft book that I'm reading and really enjoying is sort of vocalizing things that I've been thinking about, that other creative writers, especially marginalized writers, have been talking about the way our stories and our characters get interpreted in places like Workshop and Goodreads and all sorts of places. Like, is this character's too passive, or the pacing is weird, or these characters talk about food too much, or whatever, and they're um, and so this book, it's called Craft in the Real World by Matthew Sales. I don't know how to say his last name, but it's really good, and I definitely would recommend it to anybody who wants to kind of broaden their perspective of what craft can be and how it's taught. Especially if you teach creative writing, please go read that book. But yeah, so it's making me rethink and maybe consider incorporating other ways of looking at story. And I'm very curious if in the future I can make something that it hits a different structure that maybe folks aren't used to, but is still received well, and is commercially viable. Who knows?
I've seen a lot of discussion over the last few years about how, especially younger Western audiences have had a little bit of that sense of story structure tweaked a bit because of their exposure to anime and manga. Because the way those stories are told, I mean, sometimes mimics the structures that we recognize from Western storytelling, but sometimes it's wildly different. And it's particularly when you look at long haul stories, you take like something like a Neon Genesis Evangelion, like something that went like, for a long stretch and doesn't come to the places of resolution or standard beats that we would expect from stories, and that can be a little disconcerting for Western audiences sometimes. But for the younger audiences, they're coming up with something where this feels much more like their idiom, and I think they'll be more open to some of those changes of structure. I also think when you talk about the 4-point, the 4-act structure, I've often seen that referred to as like the remedy for the soggy middle, because 3-act structure tends to have, if Act 1 and 2 were pillars and there was a bridge going across them, like a hanging, swinging bridge, the second act is this dip in the middle trying to find its way back up to the middle. And that can really sink a lot of stories when you get into that soggy middle. I don't know how many books have kind of lost me when you get to the middle of the story and it feels like the plot is kind of meandering around for a while and doesn't have that sense of urgency, or it doesn't feel like the chapters accomplish enough. And I think the 4-act structure gives you a pillar in the middle to pull that back up and then create a new sense of momentum. So I like that you talked about it there. What are your tools of the trade? What do you write in? Is there particular software choices? Do you use any analog stuff? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I am a big Scrivener user. Hands down, most important tool of the trade for me. I have it on my computer, have it on my phone, my iPad, all of it. Especially since I travel a lot, it's been really, really, really important, just to have something that I know is always going to sync up between the devices. But also, I'm sitting at my desk right now, so I have my pins, my new fountain pins. Some nice notebooks, obviously, of course, more than I could ever possibly write in, some of them too pretty to ever write in.
Yeah, I know that I mean, I've got so many journals and stuff over to the side of me, some of which are the ones that I've written the most in are the ones that are the least impressive looking. The most boring looking are chock full, and the prettier they are, the more precious I get about them, and it's weird. You're also the second author I've had recently to talk about their fountain pens, because Neil Schusterman was on the show not too long ago, and he writes the first draft of every novel longhand, and has been doing so recently with fountain pens. There is something wonderful about that tactile sense of creating something physically first instead of just the digital representations. This day and age, I don't know that I could write something that long without my hands cramping up every single day, but I used to do that kind of thing. So there is a joy to it for sure. So that's very, very cool. Like I said at the top, this book comes out on March 23rd from Orbit. You mentioned in working on like the second novel, where are you at on that?
I should be turning it in to my editor soon. In theory, it should be out around the same time as book one, except next year. But don't hold me to that either. We're doing our best these days.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, and hopefully it means that the second book will arrive in an era where we can actually do things in person again, have author events, be in bookstores, all those kinds of things. I mean, the digital thing, it works out okay. I say from my little corner square of a screen, but I miss the in-person stuff in a big way. So hopefully that'll be going for you as well. As we wrap up here, where should people be following you so they can keep up with your work, with everything you're doing, with new releases, all that stuff? Where are your digital homes?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at C_L_CLARK. So at C_L_Clark. No E. And I have a newsletter if you're interested in keeping up with appearances and stuff like that, or just general like small essays or whatever. And that is at clclark.substack.com. Oh, I have a website also, which is clarkwrites.wordpress.com.
Well, awesome. Like I said, The Unbroken out here very soon, or at potentially when people are watching or listening to this, out now. Beautiful cover on this thing as well. Lots of shelf appeal. Very, very, very cool. Terrain looks awesome on there. Super badass. I always appreciate that in a fantasy cover. This, like I said earlier on, this is I think a buzzy book. I think people are going to be really drawn to this. There's a lot to chew on here. I like fantasy that has a lot of thought and a lot to teach as well as to entertain. This may be a bit of a bleak story, but it's one I think it's gonna stick with people, and they're going to want to engage with for a long period of time. So I hope everybody goes and checks it out. All the links to buy and all of the social links and stuff will be down in the show notes and the doobly-doo below. And Sheree, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really fun.